All right, quiet down. Enough. Hear me well, initiates. I am Proctor Mathias of the Order of the Quill, and I am here to replace Senior Scribe Mandelius as the one in charge of your education. The Senior Scribe has been reassigned in accordance with the needs of the Brotherhood, but that does not mean your education will be foregone. Indeed, we will resume where he left off. When last you met, you spoke about the Industrial Revolution and its effect on the Western world. You covered World War I and World War II, as well as facts of life under mobilization, and how the cancer of unrestrained technological advance began to poison society. We will pick up right there, in the US, circa 1946. The United States found itself in a unique position after the end of World War II. They alone of the major world powers were left untouched by the unrestrained fury of total war. Europe and Southeast Asia lay in ruins, as did much of Africa. Industry in the States was already purposed for mass production, and the furnaces that had fueled the fires of war turned to the production of cars and other home goods. The people at home in the US entered an unprecedented era of materialism and affluence. Elsewhere, the USSR also retooled for domestic markets, and they began to heal the ravages of war. The nations of Western Europe left behind any pretense of individual sovereignty and formed the European Commonwealth in order to better manage their own affairs. In 1949, the Communist Revolution broke out in China, and the People's Republic of China was replaced by the Communist Party of China under Mao Zedong. The great powers of the world solidified in the run-up to the 21st century, each one jockeying to control the new, emerging global paradigm. It was a time of great social change across the world. The US in particular was rocked by the civil rights movement as the 1960s dawned. African Americans and women were afforded full equal rights, and the middle class exploded, driven by a wave of materialism that raised people to a standard of living never before seen in history. They had running water in their homes, air-conditioned living spaces, personal motor vehicles, and more. People flourished in the prosperity that the post-war world brought them. The US and China in particular surged ahead of other countries in terms of development. They quickly became the dominant superpowers and direct rivals for much of the world's influence. The European Commonwealth and the USSR fell into orbit around American and Chinese policy, and a Cold War slowly emerged. The United Nations did its best to curb the rivalry that blossomed between the US and Communist China, but their influence waned more and more as the years wore on. China, for their part, doubled down on communism. They underwent a series of draconian reforms that purged any semblance of capitalism from their economy, which in turn gave the ability to pool the nation's entire resources towards specific goals. This allowed the Chinese to make enormous technological gains in a short amount of time. The United States, meanwhile, also underwent radical reorganization. In 1969, the 50 states were grouped together into 13 commonwealths, and a new flag was designed with 13 stars that reflected the new structure of the nation. The belief of the administration at the time was that it would help to streamline the actual running of the country to centralize power. State governments were disbanded, and the 50 states were reduced to little more than administrative areas within their respective commonwealth. The 13 commonwealths were the Commonwealth of New England, the Eastern Commonwealth, the Commonwealth of Columbia, the East Central Commonwealth, the Southeast Commonwealth, the Midwest Commonwealth, the Gulf Commonwealth, the North Commonwealth, the Plains Commonwealth, the Commonwealth of Texas, the Four States Commonwealth, the Northwest Commonwealth, and the Southwest Commonwealth. Alaska was included in the Northwest Commonwealth and Hawaii in the Southwest. That same year, 1969, the United States Space Agency landed the first humans on the moon with their Valiant 11 mission, heralding in a shining era of science, of reason. Technological advance carried forward at a breakneck pace. Nations raced to expand their footprint in space, and wonders once the purview of science fiction became commonplace. But you must remember, initiates, progress is never without cost. All of these new pieces of technology added to the energy demand of the world's major powers, and each nation competed to one-up the other in a never-ending dance of political intrigue. Brushfire wars in undeveloped areas of the world were common, and the space race several times threatened to turn hot. Things remained tense throughout the 20th century and well into the dawn of the 21st. Humanity's reliance on fossil fuels had begun to drive us to the brink. Oil became more and more scarce, and many of the world's most abundant oil fields began to turn up dry. Environmental degradation began to spiral out of control as many countries were driven to more and more invasive measures in order to procure oil and natural gas. Tensions rose between countries, and the prices of normal goods began to rise. The transistor was invented by 2023, though the records are unclear about who exactly invented it. Many of our scribes seem to think it was Robco Industries, while a small minority argue it was General Atomics. Regardless, the invention of the transistor led to smaller and more advanced electronics, which in turn fueled another technological revolution. However, the world had been stuck on an endless loop of consumption for many decades by 2023. Resources like oil and water had begun to run dry, soils had begun to fail, and the oceans had become thoroughly poisoned. This put an enormous amount of pressure on world powers who struggled to meet the demands of their people. As a result, the new technological revolution was pushed towards war. Robotics became commonplace, but they were tooled for use on the battlefield. Much of the development done past the year 2000 was done directly under the watchful gaze of the military and in service to the cause of war, which only served to exacerbate tensions even further. Both the United States and China dumped endless sums of money into fusion in the hopes of relieving some of the pressure caused by the rapidly dwindling supply of global fossil fuels. This race to unlock unlimited clean power led to the founding of mass fusion. Mass fusion was founded by Carl Oslo in 2043. They became one of the largest utility providers for the Northeast Commonwealth, utilizing a wide variety of fission-based technologies. All of the profit from these services was funneled towards the development of fusion, even if the ultimate goal of a fusion cell remained tantalizingly out of reach. Mass fusion continued to trumpet progress towards a sustained fusion reaction, but in truth, they struggled with an uphill battle that kept the technology from becoming viable. The strain of dwindling resources eventually began to take a toll even on the out-of-control growth of the US economy. The fantastical prosperity that had taken root at the end of World War II began to stutter, and people grappled with the rising prices of everyday goods. Gasoline and oil became prohibitively expensive, and yet demand only continued to grow as the level of scarcity increased. The United States responded to the status quo through an aggressive foreign policy. They placed economic sanctions against Mexico by citing criminal instability as a threat to oil production, which in turn was a threat to the United States' national security. These sanctions only exacerbated issues, and by the end of 2051, the US military had deployed across northern Mexico in order to keep order. In practice, these troops were used to seize control of most of Mexico's oil production industry for the United States. China responded by launching similar actions against the smaller nations on their border, and the European Commonwealth was also drawn into the international dance. Their dependence on oil ramped up tensions with the Middle East. The EC finally responded by invading the Middle East in force and attempting to seize control of oil productions for themselves. They were unable to cinch an easy victory, however, and their forces became bogged down in a horrific slog. The resource wars were fully underway across the globe by April of 2052, and they would only grow worse as time went on, and goods became more and more scarce. The United Nations collapsed under the weight of the turmoil by the end of that year. Things only continued to spiral when the following year, 2053, saw the onslaught of the new plague. a deadly virus which quickly spread between people. The new plague was feared around the world, and the United States sealed its borders. A national quarantine was declared, and day-to-day social interactions became heavily policed. Personal freedoms were curtailed across the board. Many people whispered that the new plague was an engineered weapon that was unleashed as a part of the resource wars, but this conspiracy theory has never been confirmed. If it is true, then it only serves to highlight the dangers of technology run amok. The war between the European Commonwealth and the Middle East resulted in a limited nuclear exchange that left large portions of the region irradiated. This, combined with the threat presented by the new plague, pushed the United States government to look to the future. A shadowy faction began to emerge behind the curtain, a group of powerful clandestine interests which would later come to form the backbone of the Enclave. The leaders of this emerging faction decided to utilize a private company that until then had produced personal fallout shelters for use at home, Vault-Tec, to launch a massive operation dubbed Project Safehouse. Enormous underground vaults meant to survive the nuclear apocalypse were designed, and Vault-Tec was given near limitless government contracts to see the work finished. The company exploded in size and scope nearly overnight, and the construction of hundreds of vaults began across the country. But Vault-Tec and Project Safehouse was not the only option pushed. The shadow government that would become the Enclave was smart enough not to put all of its eggs in one basket, and they funded several illicit research projects designed to launch humanity into the stars and combat the new plague. Many of these projects ended up co-opted by the military for use in the resource wars, or they became bogged down by corruption and corporate mismanagement. In 2055, West Tech Research began to engineer viruses in an attempt to end the threat represented by epidemics like the new plague. These efforts morphed over several years into the Pan-Immunity Virion Project, a massive effort to make humanity immune to disease. The project was heavily monitored by the federal government, and through them, the rapidly forming Enclave. The resource wars burned hotter and hotter for years, and the demand for oil only continued to grow as technology advanced at a rate that was truly out of control. Oil became so vital that the United States government established the Anchorage Front Line in Alaska in 2059 in order to protect its oil interests there. The US began to put an increasing amount of pressure on Canada to submit to US foreign policy. The federal government wanted to put US military personnel along the entire length of the Alaskan pipeline, but this idea was met with extreme pushback by the Canadian populace. Dissension and chaos spread through the northern nation, which in turn only increased pressure from the US as they worried about threats to the pipeline. Things got so bad that automobile traffic was stopped the world over by 2060. There simply wasn't enough oil left to run vehicles. Mass Fusion, West Tech, and other companies rushed to supply electric or fission-powered devices to the market. Many of these vehicles were advertised as fusion, but the truth is researchers still struggled to make fusion viable enough for deployment across a mass market. This forced Mass Fusion and other companies to instead rely on dirtier fission to support energy demands. Radiation leaks and meltdowns were common, but news of such disasters were kept to a minimum as the government and corporations worked in concert to manipulate the news. The oil fields in the Middle East ran completely dry by the end of 2060, bringing an end to the conflict between the European Commonwealth and the Middle Eastern Coalition. Both sides had suffered to an incredible degree, and neither had come out with anything to show for it. Dozens of vaults were completed by the end of 2063, but many more still remained under construction. Drills began in cities with completed vaults in order to prep the populace to flee to the shelters should the worst come to pass, and things did continue to get worse. In June of 2065, electricity demand grew so great that it nearly caused a nuclear meltdown in New York City. Power rationing was put into effect across the United States, and citizens were forced to get used to regularly scheduled blackouts as a part of daily life. The resource wars grew more and more fierce as competition between the US and China reached a boiling point. The United States and China both rushed to develop new and devastating weapons of war, including the very power armor our Brotherhood has come to rely upon. The demand for energy in China grew so great that by spring of 2066, they had drawn a firm line in the sand, demanding greater oil imports from the United States or else. The United States refused, and talks between the two powers broke down completely. To add insult to injury, cooperative research between mass fusion and military power armor projects resulted in the first functional fusion cells by the summer of 2066. The US now had the key to their energy woes, and they began the massive undertaking of incorporating the technology into their energy grid. The process was slow, however, bogged down by rampant corporate corruption and the demands of the military. Rising tensions with China pushed the Pentagon to hoover up most fusion technology for use in their own projects before it could be deployed to civilian markets. Only a few key areas of the nation had access to fusion-based electricity by the time the Great War began. China, pushed to desperation, invaded Alaska in the winter of 2066, sparking a war with the United States. The Anchorage front line barely held, and the state became a ravaged battleground. Canada, pressured for years to allow American troops on their soil, was reluctant to allow the US through their territory to reinforce Alaska. Finally, they caved to US pressure when given the choice between acquiescence or war, and the US military deployed their forces across the entire country. Ostensibly, they were just passing through, but the process of annexation was fully underway by 2067. US forces brutally repressed any resistance from Canadian citizens, and massacres and atrocities became commonplace in occupied Canada, only made worse by the deployment of the first usable suits of power armor, the T-45, that same year. The T-45 helped the US to hold the line in Anchorage, and the Chinese raced to develop their own suits of power armor. The war slogged on for years, and the US was forced to draw upon Canadian resources more and more, stirring up further unrest among the Canadian populace. In 2072, an extremist attack on the Alaskan pipeline gave the US government all the excuse it needed to stop pretending. It announced the full annexation of the Canadian provinces and seized the entire nation for themselves. Afterwards, the US was finally able to push China out of Alaska, and they invaded the Chinese homeland in 2074. By 2075, the experiments that had been taking place under the Pan-Immunity Virion project had borne fruit and entered the clinical trial phase. The scientists involved saw results beyond their wildest expectations, and the project was renamed the Forced Evolutionary Virus Project. The project was experimenting on mammals by 2076, and by then they had noticed an increase in aggressiveness among test subjects. The military was deployed to the West Tech Research Facility at Mariposa, the very base I am sure you all have heard of in Brotherhood legend. By the end of 2076, the military had decided to quarantine small towns throughout Royal America in order to purposefully release the FEV in order to see the results. This crime against all humanity resulted in the emergence of the first super mutants, though the military quickly eliminated most of these creatures before word of their horrific creation could spread. Learn this lesson well, initiates. The horrors of technology run amok can go beyond your wildest imaginations, and it will always result in the creation of demons beyond our control. China launched a last desperate attack on Alaska by the end of 2076, but the US was able to re-secure the Anchorage front by the beginning of 2077. Things were beginning to look dire for China as supply lines on their home front began to break down, but they were looking no better for the US. The lack of resources had pushed the government to more and more draconian measures in order to maintain control. Martial law had become a part of day-to-day life, and citizens were forced to go without basic goods. Food riots became commonplace, and more of the US military had to be deployed at home in order to maintain order. It only got worse when some enterprising hero, an icon of journalistic integrity, leaked the existence of the forced evolutionary virus and its testing on American citizens to the world. Riots erupted across the globe as everyday people protested against the violation of natural law that was the FEV and those who made it. Anarchy and lawlessness ran rampant across the countryside of North America, and the Enclave, now fully formed and coherent as an organization, retreated to their hidden bunkers across the US. It finally happened by the end of 2077. No one is sure how. Who struck first has always been a mystery. Perhaps China acted in desperation as their defensive front collapsed. Perhaps the Enclave acted to eliminate those who were rebelling against their rule. Perhaps it was Vault-Tec, looking to further their own purposes by forcing people into the vaults. I suppose the result is the same regardless of who acted first. On October 23rd, 2077, the Great War began. It ended that same day. Nuclear warheads rained down across the world and turned the surface of the Earth into a blasted, irradiated wasteland. The vaults containing the FEV at Mariposa were broken open in the conflict, and the virus leaked into the environment, twisting and mutating life across the planet. Life, as humanity had once known it, came to an end, and we were forced into the world you all know now, a terrible echo of what came before, a shadow that forever warns against the dangers of technological advancement. This is why we took up our mission, my students. It was clear in the aftermath of nuclear fire that a new way was needed. But we will discuss that another time. For now, your next session of firearms training is about to begin. Report to Proctor Smith at the armory. Remember what you have learned here today. It matters, initiates. We must learn the mistakes of the past so that we understand our duty and so that we can ensure they never happen again. Now go. Tomorrow we will discuss the aftermath of the Great War in detail, including the tale of our mythical forefather Roger Maxson and the founding of the Brotherhood of Steel. Shoot well, my students. Ad Victorum.